Welcome to the Fast Cat Cycling Coaching Podcast. I am Coach Elliott, and I am here today with Bill, the CEO of Neversecond.
Hi, Elliott. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for joining me today. Um, you're every time I talk to you, I feel like you're somewhere new. Where are you? Where are you at today? What are you doing?
Today, I'm coming just back from Europe, having done UTMB Chianti, and then I was in Treviso in Italy for a gravel race, the Hills, which is a new race, and then today we're in Arizona for Destination Trails, first race of the season, their kickoff, which is the Arizona Monster, which is monstrous. 300 miles of trail running. So doing that and then on to Sea Otter after here. So
Nice. That's super cool.
yeah.
That UTMB Chianti race looked super cool. You guys had never second athlete Jim Walmsley absolutely stomp it out there.
He crushed. He
Yeah,
absolutely crushed. He's amazing, and I had a feeling going in he seemed really ready, and he just kind of dropped in and just was ran a dominant race. Amazing to watch. So
nice. Yeah, that's super cool. I'm
yeah.
excited to see him this year.
Hmm.
Cool. Well, we have a couple announcements real quick before we get into the content for today. Um, First off, Coach Jake and Frank have had a blast doing the Sweet Spot Saturdays group rides on Zwift and want to thank all of the riders, especially Matthew Zier, who completed every ride, including the Uber Pretzel this past Saturday. Um, Big props, Matthew. You should be absolutely ripping this spring. That comes from Coach Frank. So thanks for being out there. Listeners, we'll have these rides starting again in December. And then until then, get outside, off your smart trainer, and into the great outdoors. There are more watts to be achieved outside. Um, on that topic, I will be hosting a Wednesday midday group ride here in Boulder, Colorado. So if you are a local rider and want to come mix it up, it'll be a gravel ride. We'll have some varying intensities that we'll throw in. Um, Let us know, reach out, and we'll be announcing that soon. We can give you some additional information if you're nearby. Additionally, did you know that Coach Cat speaks over 100 languages? If you're an international rider, just type into the chat, speak to me in your desired language. Last but not least, would you like your feedback in a way that is not so nice? Maybe some tough love that suits you better? Again, simply tell Coach Cat in the chat to give me feedback in X. Tough love, enthusiastic, however you're feeling. Next, we're going to give the review of the week, which comes to us from Sam Hughes. And it says, I've tried all the training apps, but none are as good as Coach Cat. If you're thinking about hiring a coach or adding some structure to your training, I highly, highly recommend. They're the best people with an amazing product. I took advantage of the Call a Coach program to get started, and then I can ask the AI questions anytime and even the real Fast Cat coaches if I want a second opinion. I'm getting ready to start my gravel season, and I'm riding stronger than I ever have. Thanks, y'all. Thanks, Sam. Cool. So that is the business side of things. And now we can kind of get into the topic for today. So today is Thursday, April 3rd, and we are about 8 weeks out from Unbound. And as coaches, when we get in that 6 to 8 week period, we want to start thinking about specificity. Um, so it's time to start doing your gravel simulation rides. We have a couple podcasts on how to do those, and we'll have another podcast on that coming out soon. But today we're going to kind of talk about a topic that I like to call dynamic fueling. And we're going to talk about some of the special fueling demands that pertain to Unbound. And we're going to talk about it with a grow in the business, Bill. Um, so, quick overview of what I call dynamic fueling. It's basically a strategy that approaches race day nutrition and applies it to real time energy demands rather than something that is a little bit more rigid, um, and what I would call like a static fueling plan. So, oftentimes for these ultra endurance events, people say like, "Hey, drink a bottle an hour and a gel every 30 minutes." And for those of us that do a lot of off road racing, that is sometimes really difficult, and it can be really hard to um, basically stay on top of that due to terrain, pack dynamics, those sorts of things. So we're going to kind of compare and contrast some of those, talk about the importance of this, and um, yeah, kind of get into that. Um, let's see. Yeah. Do you have anything to kind of add or any thoughts on the topic of dynamic fueling?
No, I'm just, from my perspective, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Elliott, and
Yeah.
happy to talk about it. And hopefully, it's a few pearls of wisdom, if I can. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing that like we were curious too is what's something that you see some of your like your pro riders doing, whether it be the ones that are in the Grand Prix or some of like your World Tour riders, like you sponsor Bahrain Victorious.
mhm.
Um, well, I guess they might have a different name now, but anyway, um, what are some of the strategies that you're seeing some of these athletes fueling with?
There's it. Well, I think one of the observations that I've had, even over since we've started as a brand, just to give a little bit of context, we've only been in business a little over 3.5 years now. And we've seen this kind of tidal wave of awareness around nutrition. Even in the last 3.5 years, the World Tour riders have really been pushing the thresholds of how much they're taking in. We've also seen that with a lot of our privateer athletes. We work, some of our privateer athletes that we work with are, Keegan Swenson, Sophia Gomez Vichafan, and Matt Beers, Mattia DeMarchi. They all have, slightly different strategies based on their physiology, but from an intake perspective, I it's safe to say that our athletes are on the nerdier side of things. They definitely plan their fueling for each event. They just don't use the same fueling plan, a static fueling plan across events. A lot of times they'll adjust their overall intakes, fluid, fuel, possibly sodium, even based on the conditions that they're going to encounter. So everything from uh, the type of terrain, the altitude, weather, what their sweat rates might be. They tend to adjust things, even up to race day based on what they think they're gonna encounter on course.
Yeah, and that's the really cool thing I think about you know y'all's product is like I call it like it's a very modular solution.
Right.
You have it from all levels, right? Like you
Mhm.
have the drink mix, you have the C30, C90, and you can dial it up and down. You have the sodium additive, so if you're a heavier sweater, you can implement that in. You can fine tune that. You have the bars, you have the gels, everything in increments of 30, which is it just makes the math really nice and clean. Um, and that's the thing, like, drawing some similarities between like myself and some of your writers saying like, they come from the nerdier side. Like I love, geeking out about the nutrition and, optimizing that to a race course because every race has a very, unique kind of demand. And whether you're talking about Unbound 200 or you're talking about, Leadville, which might be a little foreshadowing to something later,
Mhm.
um, there are unique demands. And if you take the same strategy and apply that, it might not work. Um, so yeah, ultimately, I think like understanding the concept and the theory behind this and like the mechanisms is really important as an athlete. And then what that allows you to do is train and implement those understandings and then use it on race day.
And I agree with you. I think one of the strengths, and I think values that we deliver to athlete is that modularity.
Mhm.
I think that when we look at what is the real point of difference with Neversecond is really our modularity and ease of implementation. I mean, we've really fundamentally created a system of products that's meant to work together. The products all use the same carbohydrate composition. So you mentioned 30-gram increments of carbohydrate, 200 milligrams of sodium per 30 grams of carbohydrate. We've got additive products like our S200 sodium booster, which allows athletes to personalize the sodium level in the drink mixes. We have some new products yet to be announced, which will allow further personalization, for instance, of the carbohydrate composition in our products as well, which we're really excited about. But by providing the system, it's a huge kind of sea change from, let's say, even 5 years ago, where brands were offering a assortment of products that really is quite arbitrary, meaning that they're having arbitrary carbohydrate values, arbitrary sodium values. Some products have some sodium, some don't, different compositions in the product. So, what we've fundamentally been able to do is to really deliver a system that allows an environment where athletes can really not just perfect a protocol, but personalize a protocol based on the uniqueness of the event they're going to, and to train for it. So, in the event that you're planning 8 weeks out for an event like Unbound, you have a system of products that will allow you to dial in what you're going to use and then execute it on race day according to what you've trained.
Yeah, and that's a perfect kind of segue into what I wanted to talk about next, like that um, individuality, because um, this sport is really cool because you see, especially at the pro, like even at the pro level, you see such a difference in body type and composition. You see really big riders, you see really small riders, and they're riding together up the same climb, mixing it up at the same sprint. And cycling is a very power-based sport, and energy expenditure is derived from power output. And one of the examples that I wrote down to kind of explain this dynamic fueling a little bit, um, again, dynamic fueling is kind of recognizing that your energy demands are the highest when the power is high, and that is when you need to kind of replenish your glycogen stores accordingly. Um, one, in order to stay on track and not fall behind, which is incredibly important in a 200-mile race like Unbound. And it just kind of it creates a buffer, against that. And getting back to the example, so rough math here. So you could take a 30-minute climb and, varying riders, varying, thresholds. For example, I use 200 watts and I use 400 watts. So a smaller rider, larger rider, going up the same climb, 30 minutes at threshold, you're going to burn anywhere between 360 to 720 calories. And then when you're at threshold, your expenditure is basically entirely carbohydrates.
Mhm.
So those same numbers from calories in terms of carbohydrates would be 75 grams or 180 grams of carbohydrates. 180 grams of carbohydrates in 30 minutes for a large rider, like that's a big amount. That's a big hole to dig themselves out of.
Mhm.
So if I'm not a 400-watt rider for 30 minutes, but I'm somewhere in between, and if I'm going to expend that much energy in a 30-minute climb at threshold, I'm going to kind of plan out, all right, I'm going to be fueling with liquid, throughout the entirety, and then I'm going to maybe take a gel at the beginning, and I'm going to take a gel at the top,
Mhm.
and that's going to help shore up some of those discrepancies. Um, so, yeah, again, um, bottom line is recognizing energy demands high, is when the power is high. Um, why this is important for kind of a long race, and then kind of getting into some of like the specific demands of Unbound is kind of like what I wanted to segue into next. So we were talking before this. Unbound from a terrain perspective is kind of a boring, well, not boring. It's a consistent.
Heard that a few times.
Yeah. For me, it makes this topic maybe a little more difficult, a little more boring.
Mhm.
Uh, Unbound from a terrain perspective is kind of like a consistent map. So it's not the terrain that we're applying this to; it's more the race itself and the pace. So in a lot of these gravel races, and I can tell you this from the hundreds of files that I've analyzed from some of these races. You start hard, and it just fades
Yeah.
throughout the 200 miles.
Mhm.
And this could be a scenario where you know that, like, okay, in the first 1 to 3 hours, it's going to be high intensity. I'm going to be fighting for position, trying to make the group on the road. It's going to be very much like a road race.
Mhm.
There's going to be a lot of time over threshold. There's going to be a lot of time at threshold, high sweet spot, high energy expenditure. That could be a good time to take your baseline kind of fueling rate and then maybe say, I'm going to go, you know, add an extra gel on top of that. So, for me, that might look like going from 100 grams an hour to, 130-ish grams
Mhm.
an hour.
Mhm.
And that's going to help me stay on track and not get into a hole, which if I get into a hole, 3, 4 hours into Unbound, I am in a very bad place. That's what we're trying to avoid.
Mhm.
Basically just ensuring glycogen availability for some of those like really hard efforts. Um,
A lot of the racers, when we talk to racers, one of the things I keep hearing again and again is how the starts tend to be faster than they thought, like people riding out of their skin, right? And it seems to be more common than not with a lot of the gravel races and Unbound. I think is last year showed anything. I think that's what you're
yeah,
saying is very true. Yeah.
yeah, and too, when there's some context to it, and it depends on where you're at in the race. You know, are you fighting for an age group podium? Are you fighting in the pro race? You know, you could very well be in a position where it's like that high hour of power could come at hour 6.
Yeah.
You know, because there could be a really hard selection coming out of a checkpoint where everyone's fighting for position, and that's how I just did the 100 last year. But my peak hour and 20-minute power was like 3.5 hours into the race.
Yeah.
So when you understand this topic, you're prepared to make adjustments on the fly to accommodate for that. You know, because it's not a one size fits all thing, and that's, I think, what we're trying to convey is that, like, this is a theory, and when you understand like the theory and you can apply that, you can make changes in the race. You can make changes, from one race to the next, from one ride to the next, and it is really adaptable.
I think that's one of the things that's a great takeaway, Elliot, that you're pointing to here is this need to stay somewhat flexible.
Mhm.
We encounter a lot of athletes who have, they're listened to all the communications, and yes, to the brands, including ourselves. When we communicate, a lot of times we're talking about numbers like 90 grams or 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And the first thought is, well, okay, what does my interval of feeding look like? Is it every 15 minutes? Is it every 30 minutes? Is it every 20 minutes? And, we give broad based advice so that athletes at least have a guideline to follow. But when you get into, I'll give you a great example. It's not a cycling example, but I had a really great conversation with one of our athletes, Jim Walmsley. Jim was been a Neversecond athlete for about a year and a half now. He used Neversecond. He was using it about 6 to 8 months in advance, and eventually we connected because he was buying the product himself, which was really just just surprising to see. He was kind of doing his own investigations, and And we talked about it to him. He said, I think this is going to be my secret to winning UTMB this year. In the end of the day, Jim used our products at UTMB and won. We connected afterwards, and we talked about how it went. And he said, about it, he has, in an ultra race, this is a 20-hour race, even for athletes like Jim. They're out a really long time. Um, he started to have some issues. He was taking 90 grams an hour, which for him is quite a lot. About hour 13, 14, 15, he started getting some GI problems, and he backed off a bit. He went down to 60 grams an hour for a couple of hours to allow his system time to recover. And then he continued on 60 and 90 grams through the end of the race. But I think the important takeaway from that is that you do need to stay somewhat flexible with your plan. Sometimes it's perhaps reducing for a short period your intake, and sometimes increasing your intake based on the demands and how you feel. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great example. And I had a very similar example at Sea Otter last year.
Mm-hmm.
Like I cooked it. I did the math after like the first 2 hours, and I was like, man, I was at like 130 an hour for the first 2 hours, and like that's a lot for me. And I had, fortunately, like no significant issues, but I dropped it down, and then I was able to like normalize.
Right.
And I think like one, you have to kind of train that like flexibility, and that's something that we can talk about a little bit later. Um, and you need experience with that so that like you don't just fall apart when you kind of have some of those GI issues. Um, but I would always rather like have to reduce the rate and kind of like ride it out and kind of normalize things rather than like try to play catch up later. Especially in the UTMB when you're out there for 20 hours. Like it's a lot harder to come out of a hole at hour 13 than it is to like say, okay, I just had a little bit too much, so I'm gonna like cool it for 3 hours and like get back online.
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and I mean that's the note that I just like looked at in my outline is like preventing that depletion is key, and like never rely on catching up like once you're under fueled. Um, so yeah, like having that flexibility and adaptability is just really important when it comes to these races. Um, so kind of touched on it a little bit. So it seems like high carb is just it's in all endurance sports now, and it's like very much like trending. It's been in cycling for a little bit now, but like now we're starting to see it in like ultra running and some of these other sports, and it's just very very popular. And it seems like every year like it used to be 100 grams an hour, then it was 120, and now it's like you're hearing of athletes do like 140, 150. So here is kind of maybe a time to ask what you are seeing as somebody who is like a man of the brand and of the science, and in talks with a lot of athletes, like what are some of the upper limits of kind of fueling rates that you're seeing?
I mean, there are these kind of rare athletes that are managing intakes of 150 grams or more. We always caution athletes because there is this, athletes I think are competitive. I mean, I was a lifelong athlete, so we're kind of competitive at everything, and which even carbohydrate intake. These are
Yeah.
points of conversation which sometimes can sound, we stop and think they sound a little bit ridiculous, but there's this 150 is becoming pretty common within the top tier of professionals. 120 is still for many athletes. I mean, we're talking again elite athletes. I think it's always important to remember that because we do run into a lot of amateur athletes and someone doing their first ultra, and they're a lot of times trying to follow the path of elite athletes who are taking 10 servings of product a day in training. Their guts are highly trained to tolerate a lot of product. So it's important to note also there are plenty of athletes who do very well in events in the 30, 60, 90 gram intakes. In running, generally, we see obviously a lower intake because of the jostling that goes on. I mean, there's a rare runner who's taking 120 grams an hour. Most of them, even the professional ultra runners, are in the 60 to 90 range. I remember maybe 3 years ago, even on the world tour level, there were 120 was pretty rare. Right now, we're hearing 150 for 120 to 150 on the world tour level. There are these rare athletes that are taking 180 or even 200 grams of carbohydrate per hour, and um, I mean, it's impressive. It's a lot of eating, a lot of feeding, but those are 1 in 1,000, athletes. So,
Yeah, and there's so much context and nuance to that, right? Because it's like, are you doing a 1 day race or are you doing the Tour de France?
right.
Because that's what I talk about with athletes, often is I yes, I want you training at high carb for like this individual session, but I want you training at high carb because it's going to allow you to bounce back from that session a lot faster.
Mhm.
And it might mean that you're going into tomorrow's demanding session at 100% glycogen availability rather than 70. And when you play that game over the course of a week, 2 weeks, it's like I'm responding well, adapting to the training rather than like I'm just like getting run down. And Tour de France, the Grand Tour, is like a perfect example of that.
Oh yeah, that's a really great example. And there are moments, for these riders during such a long event day after day where um, they have they're kind of riding at a lower intensity. They're able to kind of take in more. But to your point, high intake is really, I mean, a lot of athletes, when we talk about recovery, they think it's protein and sleep come to mind, but carbohydrate and what you're taking in during racing and training, having better sessions a lot of times day after day, and kind of repeating, oftentimes can be really positively impacted by your intake from the day before, and that's your carbohydrate intake for sure.
Now, with some of these athletes that are, you're seeing the really high fueling rates,
Mm-hmm.
150, for example. Now, is this kind of uniform across, kind of body weight and power profile? Or is it kind of becoming normalized to like, I have an 80-kilo rider with a 450-watt threshold and, he's putting out massive amounts of KJs. So we need to fuel at 150 rather than, maybe a smaller rider, but still high watt per kilo,
Mm-hmm.
that's just less KJs.
I think generally speaking, for our larger riders, generally their intakes are in that 150 range. I mean, if you take athlete like Matt Beers, and he's a big athlete, 120 to 150. I mean, um, he's pretty common. I mean, look at a lot of the smaller athletes. I mean, I've seen cases where some of the smaller athletes also have quite high intakes. Keegan certainly is not a large athlete, but his intakes are quite high. I mean, I think part of it for them is also they train these guys are training their guts. They use a lot of product during training. They're pretty religious about it, and a lot of times, um, I mean, although I would say in the beginning of the season, their intake levels are a bit lower, and then as they kind of as they're in their off season training, they tend to kind of do more training rides. Their intensity isn't as high. They're not consuming as much, but once they're in season, their intake levels are I'm typically seeing 120 as a very common number. 150, I still think, is not certainly an ideal for a lot of athletes. That's not really manageable. I'm seeing a lot more of the kind of 120 intake. I'm not seeing a ton of 150.
Yeah. And that's a great point, saying like, hey, they come out of winter and they might see a little bit of a lower rate, but then a few weeks later, after, resuming their normal training and kind of like bumping up,
Mhm.
we're starting to see those kind of higher rates again. Um, reminding athletes that like this increase in gut training, like literally, it takes time. And it's not something that you can just flip a switch on race day because, again, that will end very poorly, potentially with you at a porta potty at an aid station somewhere. Um, and that's like what we, talk about, like in this like unbound specificity phase or whatever race specificity phase is, we're not just like training on the bike for this event, but we're also training nutrition wise. And for a race like Unbound, I think that like I value, training your fueling strategy. I hold that like so highly, in importance of the, the things that you have to do to prepare for this event, because it's such an integral part of, race day in order to get to the finish. Like there is no possible way that like you can not fuel at Unbound 200 and get to the finish line.
It's when I look at the history of working, we work with our professionals extensively. There are two races that come to mind that usually require a certain level of special planning in their calendar. One is Leadville.
Mhm.
Usually, we see with the altitude involved, there's usually some adjustments that they make, and then Unbound, just because of its length and it's there's a well, as we saw this past year, it was quite a lot of tactical. It was pretty dynamic in terms of how the race ran. It wasn't just a slog for 10 hours. There was a lot of tactical work and adjustments in pace, and just when you take that into account, then you take the length of it. I know our guys really spend a lot of time dialing in their nutrition in advance. They really, during that block of when they're really kind of aware and working towards Unbound, let's say for that 6 or 8 weeks prior, they're fully focused on it. They really nutrition does become an extremely important part of that planning.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's super fun. Like as an athlete and as a coach, like I love, coming up with like really unique solutions,
Mm-hmm.
not just for the race, but also for the individual.
Mm-hmm.
Because everyone has their own preference.
Oh yeah.
Um, One thing that I think, can be unique to Unbound, is the heat. Um, and I've only been there once. Last year was pretty mild. I think the last few years have been pretty mild. Um, and I mean, people will correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if like we've seen like really excessive heat, at Unbound. Like there have probably been a few years that have been pretty bad, but
Mm-hmm.
it's like, a combination of like potential heat, humidity, but then also the exposure
Mm-hmm.
because you're out there for so long.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the way that heat impacts fueling and digestion. Do you just want to kind of like talk about that a little bit and some of the things that you see athletes doing to adjust maybe sodium rates, and then also like are they lowering their grams per hour, their fueling rate?
I think the sodium intake is one that typically comes up a lot at Unbound. I've been at Unbound the last few years, and yeah, I would say it has not been. It's been hot and just it's always pretty humid.
Yeah.
The heat definitely takes a toll, and we've definitely seen some flawed fueling strategies, even with our athletes. Like a great example is Sophia. A couple of years ago, she tended to match Russell Finsterwald's fueling plan pretty closely, and Russell's a heavy sodium sweater, and she's actually on the lower side, and she started to get some GI issues later in the race, and she attributed that to just too much sodium intake. So I think it's a really important takeaway, and not everyone has the means. I mean, obviously Sophia and Keegan, Matt, Russell, they're very aware of their physiology, and I mean they've done a lot of testing, but for it's definitely worthwhile for athletes if they have the means to have their sweat tested, to give some information as to how they may want to look at sodium as part of their overall fueling strategy. I mean, as a brand, we provide a system of products that allows you to manipulate it, but the other part of that is knowing what to manipulate it to.
Right.
And so a lot of athletes and we see it all the time. Athletes come to us at events, and they've been unfortunately trained that the idea that more is better of everything. It's a very common mistake athletes make is, okay, I'm going to take a ton of sodium because I don't want to, I want to make sure I have enough. but there is too much. So, especially when you get into a race like Unbound, when you get into these really long races, a lot more can go wrong with imperfect strategies. So, look at it this way: a lot of athletes will come to me and say, "Okay, I'm doing a half marathon. It's over in an hour and 30 minutes."
Yeah.
In reality, only so much can go wrong,
Yeah.
right? But when you're getting into a 10-hour or 15 or however long you're out in a race like Unbound Gravel, a lot more can go wrong. So if you have a flaw in your strategy, it can really start to exacerbate itself. The example I gave of Jim Walmsley, perfect example. It's like, yeah, the issues happen, 2/3 of the way into the event, which is, it's a pretty dark place to be in when you're 2/3 of the way into a very, very long event and you've got
Yeah.
something that's not working. So I would say sodium really becomes an important consideration. Um, generally speaking, when we give broad-based advice to athletes, we also tend to kind of, based on the heat. So as you get into this really warm weather, you do really need to think about your fuel to fluid ratio. So if, for instance, you're using drink mixes, well, generally, again, giving broad-based advice, athletes, we have a choice of C90, which is a 90 grams of carbohydrate per serving, or we have our C30 mix that you can make a C90 from. The difference is that that C30 mix uses 200 milligrams of sodium per 30 grams of carbohydrate, where the C90 is 200 per 90. We wouldn't recommend, and again, broad-based advice. We'd recommend using the C30 to have a roughly 600 milligrams of sodium per 90 grams. As you get into races like Unbound, though, and you have to really think about, okay, what's my overall sweat loss during this? What's my fluid loss during this event, especially in the hotter weather? Generally speaking, you need to be thinking, okay, I probably need to dilute the drink mixes so that as I'm taking it, it's the right kind of balance between fluid intake and carbohydrate and sodium intake. And so, looking at the weather and understanding the weather and kind of training toward that with the right dilution levels in the drink mixes becomes especially important when you're dealing with hot weather. And it's been hot and humid like you'll encounter at Unbound.
Yeah. Yeah. That was one thing I was going to ask you about was like, was sweat testing. Cause
Mhm.
that seems like something that has become a little bit more like widely available recently.
Yes.
Um, if you live in a big city, like you can probably find a physiology lab at a university somewhere and like go
Mhm.
get sweat testing for reasonably cheap. Like it's going to be an expense, right? But if you're taking the time, and energy to, devote to training and racing, that's highly useful, information. Um, and like you said, like when you do an event like Unbound compared to, a half marathon or like a cross country mountain bike race that's 90 minutes, like the consequences are so much higher because you're out there for so much longer. And it just like, it is almost like exponential, the longer you're out there.
It is, and I agree with you. And right now, we're seeing a lot of these sweat testing facilities pop up, and the whole range of services. I mean, um, Oscar Yeikendrup, who's my partner at Neversecond, he was kind of pivotal we in the past has worked with Gatorade. He was pivotal in kind of creating that Gatorade sweat patch test, which is a
That's
fairly solid device. I mean,
yeah,
I think I don't see it very much. It seems like it may be off the market or not as widely available as it used to be, but there are a range of testing facilities now, and which is really great to see. As a brand, we're actually looking for one to tie together with, so that when we look at our offering, we're saying, okay, we have this product. The next
hmm
question is from an athlete is, okay, what should I take? And you end up having typically a conversation that's talking about, well, when they sweat, do they see, is it white? Are they a crusty sweater? And you're going off of kind of these broad-based descriptions of kind of how they think they are.
yeah,
And then what we're doing is we're kind of anecdotally recommending a conservative step of adding a couple of capfuls of S200 into a mix if they think they're a heavier sodium sweater. Generally, we don't want people going off the deep end with their sodium intake. Many athletes come to us and say, okay, there's a range of these kind of lifestyle hydration products. I'm going to not mention any of their names, but they have copious amounts of sodium in them. Um, it's important to note that taking more or too much is a problem or can be a problem. And so we usually recommend a more kind of balanced approach, even if we don't know someone's specific information. But again, I always recommend these testing services are becoming more and more widely available that athletes look at them. And I spoke to Oscar at length about it, and kind of where things are going. And it's a very kind of nuanced arena as well. We're doing sweat testing with some of our professionals. It involves monitoring, doing testing under different conditions over a period of time, sometimes a month even. So for them, it's quite a commitment. But for your everyday athlete, you can do a quick and dirty test and at least have data that's useful. You'll know
Right.
if you're off the charts or a low sodium sweater, or you're somewhere in the middle, and at least you'll have a general idea, which I think is important.
Yeah, it's like I at least have a baseline for myself now, and then I can slightly maybe adjust given extreme kind of environmental conditions, rather than like literally just like closing my eyes and throwing a dart.
Exactly. I mean, one of our professionals is Katie Scheid. She's again another trail runner, not a cyclist in this case, but she assumed she was a heavy sodium sweater. Then she got tested with her nutritionist. She's not as high as she thought, and she has since then modified her intake to a lower level, which has been worked out really well for her. And she's had some more of a stomach sensitivities, and that's come from one source that we think it could have been was just um, taking too much sodium over too long a period of time. So,
Hmm. Yeah,
and
interesting.
Katie's someone to watch. Obviously, she's an amazing,
Yeah.
amazing woman and amazing athlete, just doing incredible things in the sport. So,
Oh yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's cool following some of the other Neversecond athletes that
yeah,
you guys sponsor,
yeah. We're pretty
especially from
blessed.
like the different sports. Like I think that like when you open your eyes to the other sports, that you see things differently from different angles, different approaches, and it's also just really cool. It's also like amazing feats of performance.
Oh, it is. It's what's amazing is that actually when we talk to them, a lot of them know each other. It's a small world, but even though they're from completely different sports, they do follow each other. So Sophia Gomez Vichafan occasionally communicates with Katie. They kind of have
Yeah,
this relationship over Instagram, and it's
that's
nice to see. I think one of our dreams as a brand is to kind of get them all in a room and do some sort of a off season, just kind of a gosh, like a just a I don't want to call it a camp, but something like a camp, and getting them together just to kind of see what would happen because you just got these athletes like Jim Walmsley, and Jim takes a lot of cues. Jim learned about us through cycling. Actually, he used to
nice.
watch World Tour, and that's how he kind of came in touch with us. But just be fun to kind of put them all in a room and see what happens. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Nice. Um, Cool. So my next point is actually very conveniently timed because I was putting this outline together, and this was before I think your most recent product release, which was the unflavored
Mhm.
line. So managing palate fatigue. Um, Long races, like palate fatigue is a real thing. If you're sipping on the same flavor of, X for 10 hours, like
Mhm.
after a few hours, you can be like, I don't want this anymore. And that can discourage, fueling. Um, what was that kind of the, impetus, I guess, for the unflavored line, or what? Like,
I mean, one of the things that we really try to do as a brand, I think we really have tried very hard to kind of do things our way. And listening is one of the things that brands really would do well to do. I mean, listening to feedback is really important. Um, so when we came in as a brand, we made a deliberate decision to have flavors because athletes want choice. And at the time, that was all about avoiding flavor fatigue,
mhm,
giving people options. And one thing about our flavors, I will note that generally speaking, I try a lot of other brands just to kind of see where we fall. generally speaking, our products are very palatable. They don't have super, super, super strong flavors, and the sweetness. A lot of gels, and they're almost impossible to get down because they're so sweet. Ours, I think, are quite palatable. Um, but over the last year, we started talking to a lot of our professionals like Jim Walmsley and Keegan Swenson, Russell Finsterwald, Matt Beers, and they were Katie Scheid also was like, I'd love to also have an unflavored version to break it up. And there are some unflavored uh, options out in the market. You have Morton has traditionally been unflavored, Precision Fuel is unflavored, but I think Neversecond we were like, well, there's a real opportunity here to offer both flavored and unflavored options but at the same time, when you look at these unflavored options, aside from Neversecond that are in the marketplace, a lot of them don't have sodium at a level that's negligible. And so for us, it was really a great opportunity to launch really, I wouldn't say the first, but I think the first unflavored range that also delivers the 30 grams of carbohydrate by 2 to 1, and which delivers 200 milligrams of sodium per serving. And so when you taste them, you can really taste the difference side by side with these unflavored range in the market. A lot of them taste, I think, sweet, where ours
Mm-hmm.
have this kind of sweet and salty mix, which is reflective of having the 200 milligrams of sodium. But to answer your question, we launched it really to get so that we would be the first brand to have both options for athletes who either prefer unflavored, and they're out there. They definitely I've done some testing, and there are some athletes who just want unflavored, and then also for those athletes that like flavor, that they can kind of go back and forth and change things up a little bit without compromise, meaning that these are still meant to be mixed with our other gel and other product range without any. So it's a real seamless integration within our flavored range.
Yeah, and I think like it's so perfect, and the timing, like I almost like laughed when I saw that like release, because I already had this outline written, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I did Bill already see this? Like it was perfect.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that like is perfect, and I mean I don't have anything else to say like really on that topic. It's like, yeah, mix it up to prevent fatigue. Just simply changing the flavor for like a couple of hours, or a couple bottles can help. um, I've done some like really, really long endurance rides before, and that like gas station like bag of chips, that can just be like a reset sometimes.
Oh
That can
yeah.
be a game changer. So like maybe it's that about yourself, and at the checkpoint, the final checkpoint in Unbound, you just grab a handful of like salty chips, and that kind of helps to reset the palate. Um,
It does. I also think there's this whole when we've talked to so many athletes. Like for instance, I was at the Hills Gravel, which is Mattia DeMarchi's new race in Italy this past week, and we did a demo where we basically were like, I want what I do. What I want people to tell us is their real feelings, unbiased. I don't want, as a brand, we always want to get true information, not information or feedback from people that are just being nice, right? Because being nice will do nothing but get us all in trouble. We want honest, brutal feedback. And so what we did is we served up our citrus flavored gel next to unflavored, and we did a simple demo, taste each, and then take one on your group ride. It was preceding a group ride the day before the event. What was amazing was the outcome. I was honestly nervous before I did it because I was like, gosh, I hope everyone's going to love the unflavored. I hope. You just never know, right? You could flop, right?
yeah.
And 50% of the people chose unflavored.
Wow.
And that was unbiased. Try one, tell us which one you want. And I would say it was just about an even split down the middle. So to that point, I think there is when we've talked to people too, some folks just want flavor. They just think it's really an important part of their experience, if you will. Other folks are very kind of fundamental. They just want something that works. They don't even care what it tastes like. They just want it to work. We obviously know that we need to deliver, even if it's unflavored, it still needs to taste palatable. I think we've done a job. It's actually an easy product to develop because what you're doing is fundamentally taking the flavor out. It still has a flavor, but you've removed the flavor additive that's in it. So what you're left with is what the product is, and that's
Yeah.
so I do think it's going to be a real success and a real value for a lot of athletes.
Yeah, that's cool. I was I was excited to see that with again the timing. I was like, oh sweet, like that's something that I'll
Yeah.
have to try for Unbound training. And I I think like it also is just like a good addition to like the Neversecond like lineup of just like you have this complete like fueling solution of like what do you think you need and it's there, you know?
Well, yeah, that's the
Really
idea. Is I
cool.
mean, right now we look at where we are in our kind of our evolution as a brand. So that was very when we and we all I should mention we also just launched our C30 sports drink in unflavored, which is also getting tremendously good reviews
Yeah.
from athletes like Katie Scheid who just don't like flavor. She was really pleased to be working with it now. So she just wrote me a text this morning saying how much she liked it. That was a really good sign. But as we start to look at kind of like what are the next steps as a brand, it's going to be for us. We have to finish our fueling range and then really start to kind of push down on our innovation products. And I think one of the challenges with innovation products is for us when we kind of look towards what those would be, they have to be completely evidence based and not based in pseudoscience. And so it looks like a pretty exciting year or two ahead of us in terms of what's to come.
Nice. That is cool.
Yeah.
Um, so I think one more maybe kind of bullet item before we kind of wrap it up. So caffeine.
Yes.
I kind of like I have a strategy for how I approach like caffeine in race and that sort of stuff. Um, what would you recommend? What do you see, athletes doing that works for them?
Great question. We have I should mention we have a really good article on the website that talks about
Hmm.
microdosing caffeine as an example, but
Yeah.
versus large doses and so forth. What I've I mean, there's the advice that we give, and then there's what we hear from athletes, and then there's what other brands do. A lot of the brands are pushing kind of like take a caffeinated gel every other gel or something like this, which is just stock advice because it almost is like you want to look like you know what you're talking about. Like take it every other one. There's no particular reason for saying that, but that's the
Yeah.
advice. Generally speaking, I mean, we have to go to also like what the guidelines are. You know, we look at what's the maximum intake per day. Let's say it's 300 milligrams. I know some athletes are blowing past that by 10 a.m. They're, as myself included. We also look at like Ironman athletes or like ultra. A lot of ultra athletes are taking a ton of caffeine.
Yeah.
And they have such a tolerance. And it's also important to mention that caffeine intake is highly personalized. I can drink coffee at 7 p.m. and sleep like a baby. My wife can't have it after 2 in the afternoon. And so it's important to kind of note the differences in people. Generally speaking, I always recommend that people, obviously, when they're talking about a caffeine strategy around racing, just like with fueling, you need to train with it. Um, we have a lot of athletes that a lot of athletes do a top off, like a gel top off before start of an event. Might be a good opportunity to take that caffeine gel. We tend to advise athletes to reserve caffeine for low moments especially during really long events, and so that they just don't become, they're not taking them all the time, so that they're just they build up a real kind of tolerance for taking it. And then also, if there's key moments during a race, like maybe an hour 30 from the finish, it's important to mention also that you don't want to take caffeine in a race when it's so close to the finish line that it's not even really in your system yet. Some athletes will take it 10 minutes before the finish,
Yeah.
and it's kind of useless in that environment. So we recommend typically maybe an hour 30
Yeah.
before you finish, so that, with maybe 30 minutes to be in your system at maximum um, level, that you'd be wanting to take that into consideration, that it takes 30 minutes to really kind of be functioning as you'd like it to, and that it should be an hour and a half from finish would be a good place to take. And then again, as I mentioned, during low points when you really could use it, to reserve it for that. I generally don't give advice like take a caffeine gel every other gel or every hour or every other hour or something like that, because I just don't really understand the point of that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Like, where does that? There's so much understanding. Like, where does that fall in the race? Like, it might not make sense, right? Like, you might be about to go into like a long downhill or like a big flat where there's a lull in the race, and there's literally like you're just wasting
Right.
that. I like I always race with a couple in my pocket, kind of one as an emergency for that low moment, you know.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm always like looking at the course and I'm trying to digest like where are going to be the key moments,
Yeah.
and it kind of goes back to like the concept of it's similar to like the concept of like dynamic fueling and like where your energy demands. Am I about to go up Columbine in Leadville, and that's like crucial? Like I'm probably going to rip a caffeine gel, leading
Mhm.
into that so that I, have that hit, on the bottom slopes.
Mhm.
You Something like Unbound, I think is like a little harder. I would probably say like, yeah, man, like maybe one on the start line, knowing that like there's probably going to be like a awkward kind of opening, 30 minutes, and then the race like might be pretty heavy, and
Right.
start hard after that. And then yeah, like having some in the background and like knowing the course and understanding like where are the key moments going to be. Like, is there a significant pinch point at mile 75 that I think that there's going to be, a fight for position?
Mhm.
Sometimes there's a bit of a gamble in that because you can completely like roll the dice on that and then be wrong. But that's bike racing.
Yeah.
So that's how I like to go about it. And it's kind of back to like your kind of basis of like, well, what's the purpose, and like why are you saying every hour or every other gel or something like that? Like we need some real reasoning behind this.
That's
um,
a great point. I think, so many of the brands historically were like, take a gel every 45 minutes. And you're like, where did that advice come from? It's completely
yeah,
just,
what?
it's so that they can give a direction. It's not really that it's the right direction. It's just a direction.
Yeah.
But yeah, with caffeine, I should mention, by the way, we have working on, we're going to do a reveal in this. We're going to do we're launching in fairly short period of time. We're going to be launching a caffeine shot, which,
To
one of
go
the
in the
things we're trying to
mix.
do is, again, as part of that modular approach, is separate the caffeine from the gels. Right now, we have caffeine is 75 milligrams in the caffeinated energy gels, the C30 pluses, but we will be in fairly short period of time launching a 200 milligram caffeine shot. Um, what's that like? It's not that different from like a 5 hour energy,
Yeah.
and but one
Oh,
thing
I see.
about the one I think an important point around caffeine, just so to kind of ground the conversation around caffeine. Caffeine is the world's most widely used legal performance enhancing drug. Using it wisely, of course, we're not recommending people take 200 milligram caffeine shots, every other hour. So it's really should be reserved for the right time. And there will be some good education around it. I think one of the things we owe athletes as a brand is always supportive education around product, so that it's not misused, right? So
Yeah, that's really cool, and that is like absolutely your like come back from the dead, uh,
yeah, sometimes you need that.
emergency supplement. Um,
Right.
some fueling in a caffeine shot to bring you back, and you can get to the finish.
That's exactly it. I have to admit, had like an overnight flight, and I was a mess a couple weeks ago, and I was like, what do I need right now? And I had a
Yeah,
5 hour energy that we were testing in the house just to
yeah,
evaluate, and it got me through the morning. Through
yeah.
everything else. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Um, well, we can kind of start wrapping up. One of the things that I had it in my brain earlier, and I wrote it down to get back to, and you just mentioned something a minute ago that brought me back to this thought. So, one thing like I do as an athlete, and as a coach, when I'm helping people figure this out,
Mhm.
a lot of times in these events, you know, like the question is, how do we build this, right? Like, how do you build your fueling plan?
Mhm.
And a lot of times in events, we're kind of constrained by aid stations. When can we get fueling? Like, what am I carrying? That sort of stuff.
Hmm.
And that is always where I start. Like, that's my baseline to build this strategy.
Hmm.
So I'm going to say Unbound 200, I have, a checkpoint at mile 75 and then mile 150, probably. What kind of fluids, do I think I'm going to take? What are the estimates for the time? Am I just going to do bottles? Am I going to do a Camelback? You know, and then I start kind of building my baseline of like, all right, I'm going to have C90 in both of those bottles.
Hmm.
You start adding this up, and this is how we start to like build that kind of fueling strategy. You know, okay, 6, 7 bottles over the duration, Camelback, 720 grams, estimated race finish time divided by that gives me a fueling rate. And then I'm going to say like, okay, that is my baseline. I always consider like, bottles as kind of like the baseline because I'm consistently sipping on that throughout
Hmm.
the duration of the day.
Right.
And then, the gels, bars, whatever you prefer, that's where you get that kind of custom fine tuning
Hmm.
uh, as you relate it to the demands of the race.
Hmm.
And I know kind of the deficit of, okay, what's my target? 100 grams an hour. And through bottles alone, and fluids, I'm at 70. Okay, I'm going to try to aim for, a total of like 10 gels. And then you start to build, that strategy and kind of like visualize it and see it come together.
Hmm.
Um, and then kind of when you know that, in Unbound, again, it's like, it's kind of gray, like where you put those. Um, you could assign them to mile marker or something like that, or just like where the energy is kind of going to be expended. Start a little heavier and then kind of taper it off as the race goes on. Or if it's a race like Unbound, BWR, like climbing heavy, where the power is going to be high,
Hmm.
you can centralize the fueling around
Hmm.
there. That's how I like build that strategy, um, because I think like it's a very potentially like nebulous topic, right? And can be kind of like daunting if you just tell somebody this like concept of dynamic fueling and say like you have a 200-mile race, like figure it out. So I wanted to provide some like vision and some steps on like how to get there ultimately, and that is what works for me.
Well, I think that, I mean, what you're describing is we encounter that at races all the time. So many folks come up to us and say, "Look, what should I do?" And
Yeah,
when you get past the advice, we just met them 5 minutes ago, right?
yeah,
And they're like, "What should I do?" And they're like, "Okay." And you're many times you're at like square one. You're like, "Okay,
yeah,
this is your fluid, your fuel, your sodium needs. This is," and then they say, "Great, now what?" And so, to your point, a plan is super important. It doesn't take a, I mean, it can be done at least to a fairly rudimentary one, can be done pretty quickly. But to your point, a lot of times knowing where the aid stations are, what's available to you, it varies tremendously race to race. And that becomes a critical point because that impacts what you carry. I mean, one piece of advice, and we have always kind of kernels of advice that we give people, is you can always usually find water on course, but you can't find fuel necessarily. Um, and so, to carrying sometimes becomes necessary. Carrying your fuel. Um, a lot of athletes carry the powder so they can kind of mix if they needed to on
yeah.
course if they don't have aid station availability and these sorts of things. But definitely planning is an important part.
Yeah, and for your sake, so you don't have to answer these questions, and for the athlete's sake, like please do not show up to your event asking, someone from a nutrition company, like, what do I do for my fueling? Because it is too late, realistically, to figure that out. And to tie it all back, like, now is the time to practice and figure that out. Do your training rides, build up, progress, and figure that out now so you can, fine tune, decide what works for you, and you show up on race day and you have your plan and you're not asking Bill what you should do and how many gels you should take and when you should take them.
And that is a great piece of advice. You know, um, we do see that a lot, and a lot of athletes. Look, I get it. They want to race, but it isn't necessarily the most important thing in their lives. And historically, a lot of folks are really a little bit lazy about fueling.
Mhm.
Um, but you know, Oscar has this one saying, which I think is really important, and it's true. It's not just a something he came up with, an opinion. He said that proper nutrition is one of the easiest ways to improve performance or outcome without having to train for it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of athletes will spend money on like $1,000, you know, they're making something 15 grams lighter, and they'll completely neglect their fueling. And we even you know historically we've seen that even at the professional level where they can be some athletes are a bit lazy about it. It's something that can really make a huge difference. And what's amazing is like the feedback on a positive. When we get a lot of feedback, it just really makes us smile when athletes will say to us, "I started using your products, and I understand what I'm doing now. I get the system. It's so easy to follow, and I feel so much better. I didn't realize how badly I felt until I that I was able to recover and repeat training, and it's a lot of it relates to proper fuel in their system and having a system and just using it with a nice regimen that allows them to kind of repeat the activity day after day without, to your point, like breaking down as the training sessions go on day after day.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that that is, one of the things that, one of the reasons like why we're seeing, some of the performances and just breakthroughs that, we're seeing. And it's not like, if you're paying attention to other sports, it's not limited to cycling. Like you're seeing these performances in other sports, endurance sports, and then even beyond too.
I mean, records. This is the year of shattered records. I mean, look at.
Mhm.
I mean, we're seeing things that we've never seen before. And I'm not going to go out on a limb and say, oh, it's all fueling. However,
Yeah.
and it's funny because I think there's an inherent distrust of that
Hmm.
statement that fueling can be really. A lot of athletes are like, oh no, it can't be that. Uh, it can make a huge difference. I mean, some of the studies Oscars produced over, during the mid 2000s were just really startling when you take like a placebo and compare it to just glucose. Then you would compare glucose and fructose to glucose, and you'd start to see these very not little gains, massive gains. And now that you have this kind of widespread implementation of proper fueling that's gone on, you're seeing this real sea change with times. Now, of course, in running, shoes have a lot to do with it, and the bikes are getting faster, and aerodynamics are there, and all these different elements. But nutrition is really one that's often neglected. And obviously, we're in the business, so we see this firsthand. And sometimes, we may come across as biased, but we do know that how important it is to. If you look at the professionals, their nutritionists are spending a lot of time on fueling because they know it can make a big difference, and that's why you're seeing all these. One of the reasons we're seeing so many of these kind of breakthrough times that are happening now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's super cool.
Yeah.
Super fun. And, from my perspective as a coach that works with a lot of athletes, surprisingly, like there's still a lot of people out there that need to work on this. Um, and, like ask questions, like think about this topic, kind of like in depth and like, understanding and like think about how you can apply it and yeah, go from there. So, um, I think that is probably a good way to wrap things up. I think we've kept you long enough and you're a busy man, so I want to let you get on. But yeah, I want to say thank you for joining and chatting with me about this topic. It's super fun, and I just love talking about these things with you. You're so like knowledgeable and have so much experience, with all of these athletes that you're in contact with.
Oh, Elliot,
Um,
thanks as well. I really appreciate the time and having me in, and it's always a pleasure talking with you and the team at FastCat as well. Thanks so much for having me.
yeah, you're very welcome. So, listeners, good luck with your training. If you like this podcast and the content. We'll probably have some other stuff later in the year that is similar with a different race. Let us know if you have questions, and we're happy to answer those for you. So thanks again, and we will talk to you guys later.